Hello, everyone. Hope you're doing well. Today I'm going to talk about the 1981 sci-fi film Scanners, written and directed by David Cronenberg. And I have the Criterion DVD right here with the very striking cover they did for this. They did for Scanners. So, Scanners is very much a film of its time. That you have so many films, late 70s, early 80s, that deal with telekinesis. Films like Carrie, Firestarter, the two Stephen King stories. Brian De Palma had directed The Fury a few years before, which has almost a very similar plot to Scanners, about people who can harness the power of their mind to manipulate objects and things like that. Cronenberg, a Canadian filmmaker who had made a few films prior to Scanners. Actually started making films as a student in the late 60s, early 70s. He had done films like Shivers and The Brood, and those are just a few. Rabid, another film that he made. Even those early films are all deal with Cronenberg's fascination with body horror, with violence and technology and human desire. All these themes Cronenberg really is able to really put his own specific signature on. So Scanners is about a group of people who have the power to control reality or control material reality with their minds. They can use it to weaponize. Of course, this is the movie with the exploding heads, of course, and early in the movie we get the very famous scene where Michael Ironside, who plays Ravak, the evil scanner, is able to blow up people's heads, and very memorable effect. And I'd read that was how initially the first scene of the movie, but apparently it shocked people so much that Cronenberg moved it up a little bit later in the movie. So I don't know how the exploding heads plays today, but this is early 80s, so a lot of practical effects before CGI. This all had to be done mechanically without any help from computers at all, so that's impressive. But back to the plot. So we learn that there are these people out there who can harness the power of the mind. The protagonist of the story, who's played by Stephen Lack, when we meet him at the start of the film, he kind of has a transient existence. He wanders around the shopping mall, stealing food from the food courts, and is able to induce people into seizures, I guess, if they make him angry. But then he's taken to this institute, and we meet Patrick McGowan as Dr. Paul Ruth, who oversees the scanners. He's done experiments with them, taken data, and he works for a corporation that kind of fosters the development of these scanners and keeping track of these people who have these incredible abilities. And then we also learn there's another rival corporation that wants to militarize these people and basically weaponize their powers, and the whole idea of weaponizing the human brain is a big theme in this movie as well. So it's interesting how governments are not involved in the film. It's mainly about tech corporations. It's a techno-thriller in some levels, especially towards the end, and how these very wealthy, powerful corporations are harnessing technology for some devious ends, one might say. There's also another theme in the film as well. We're really in that era. I talked about this as altered states, where this end of 60s and 1980s in conflict with each other, where we learn there are a group of scanners who, led by Jennifer O'Neill, who she gets to lead in the movie as Kim Obrist, who she is sort of with these scanners who are benevolent. They want to use their powers to achieve a kind of transcendental state and to improve humanity. But of course, they are being hunted down and killed by Ravok and the evil scanners, and even, everyone talks about the exploding heads, but the way Cronenberg handles violence, no one he has this visceral way of, there are shootouts, there are car crashes in this movie, and he just makes them brutal. Like, there's no romanticized violence or even stylized violence. I always find it really, it's almost lacerating the way Cronenberg puts violence on the screen, especially in this film, where there's a scene where the Jennifer O'Neill and the scanners are having a meeting and they are ambushed by the bad guys, and it is just brutal, and there's other scenes like that in the movie as well, and that's something that, Cronenberg, we talk about body horror all the time with Cronenberg, but he's also unique, I think, in the way he portrays violence in his movies as well. So the plot itself, and I know a lot of people have criticized performances in this movie, in particular Stephen Lack, who was not necessarily a professional actor. He was an artist, performance artist, as Cameron, who is sort of like the one of the special scanners who both sides are vying for. And I mean, the performance is fine. It's kind of eerily a deadpan performance that he gives, where this character just seems to be so disturbed and confused all the time by what he's able to do. So I thought the performance was fine as far as how it communicates that idea. Of course, you have Patrick McGoohan, famously from The Prisoner, the great TV show, and he's also good in the film as the mysterious scientist behind the scanners, and had played a big role in creating the scanners, which, as we learned in the film, was a result of an experimental drug used in the 1940s and 50s that caused mutations in these children. Clearly, the parallel there might be with thalidomide, the drug that was used 40s and 50s, which caused birth defects in children. So there is that idea too in the film of pharmaceutical companies and how they use drugs, and so there is, like, everything in this movie is so sinister. I mean, just every scene, every moment in the movie just has this sinister undercurrent to it. There's a humanism running throughout it as well, but it's really almost overwhelmed by just the sense of foreboding that Cronenberg's able to achieve throughout the film. And Michael Ironside, early role for him, he would be in a lot of science fiction movies, and he was just really great as Ravek, just a really, really a menacing villain in this movie, of course, who has an even more maniacal plot to create a group of scanners who will, as he says, sort of take over the world in some ways. So, the idea of mutations in humanity, that's been a big part of pop culture. Clearly, the X-Men is probably the most famous example of that, but we've seen that in other movies. The idea of humanity beginning to evolve in mysterious ways that could be used for good or ill, and that's another good theme in the film. I should talk about the music by Howard Shore in the film. It's just such a bleak score, if that makes sense. Just it's almost the score is almost it sounds sharp, or it's such a abrasive score sometimes, where the orchestral score and the strings are so prominent, and it really, from the opening credits, you really feel like you're going into a really grim story, and the Shore's music is really good in that regard here. And I think just the way I talk about Canada and the way Cronenberg, the visual style of his movies, there's just like this overwhelmingly, the color scheme always feels, especially in Scanners, like you're overwhelmed with whiteness and neutral colors sometimes, and there's almost like this pale sheen running through the film that it just has this very clinical feel to it, and everything about this movie has just that alienating clinical feel to the way everything is filmed in the movie. Like in the outdoor scenes, it's always like partly sunny outside. It just feels like you can see the sunlight, but it's always within like this very cloudy atmosphere. I don't know, it just feels very Canadian to me, the way Cronenberg films it. And even the buildings in this movie, all the buildings, we get a lot of exterior shots of buildings, and they all just feel very industrial, nondescript, and alienating. And I love the contrast with what's going on inside these buildings and but they look so banal from the outside. So there's that too. I think the idea in the movie where even the scanners can start to manipulate computers, I find that very interesting too, and that almost has another even more ominous feel to it. Once again, the idea of using the human mind to harness technology, weaponizing the human mind. That's another, I think, thing in this movie that really works. Yeah, so the special Dick Smith, who did a lot of the makeup effects in this movie, who had famously worked in The Exorcist. I think he did Altered States, I just talked about. So he was doing incredible work at this time. Cronenberg is really getting into the peak of his powers. Of course, he's still making really great films up to this day. And Scanners is just a really memorable movie of its time with the focus on psychokinesis, but at the same time, it feels like a really unique and singular vision. I much prefer this movie to The Fury, the De Palma film, which is more of a traditional spy type of thriller. And I think by using corporations instead, it just gives everything a much more sinister undercurrent with Scanners, of course. And his next film, The Dead Zone, which I'll be talking about, also very similar story about a protagonist with gifts that able to harness the power of his mind, but in a much different way. And The Dead Zone is in some ways a much more humanistic film, whereas The Scanners, especially the ending, gets nihilistic, especially at the end. So a memorable film on many levels. The visual style, the effects, the performances. Scanners, yes, highly recommended. Thanks for watching, and I will talk to you later. Bye.